I'm Peter Rees. I'm Professor of Places and City Planning at the Bartlett UCL. But for 3 decades I was the Chief Planning Officer of the City of London. And we are actually sitting in the centre of one of the world's financial districts at the moment. It might seem surprising with the greenery around me. And in fact we're in the middle of a residential estate called the Barbican, home to about 4,500 people, which is nearly half of the residential population of this financial square mile. Although, of course, there are 500,000 people who work here every day. In addition to the 4,500 residents living here in the Barbican estate, this is also an international arts centre with a concert hall which is home to the London Symphony Orchestra, 2 theatres, 3 cinemas, a library, a large plant conservatory, and behind me the City of London School for Girls. The whole of this area developed on the foundations of an old Roman fort, hence its name the Barbican. And indeed parts of the old Roman and medieval London city wall are still visible within the estate, as is a church built originally by Christopher Wren and largely, or partly at least, built out of Roman brick. The ruin in the next shot will show you part of the City of London's wall. And this is a wall which started in Roman times, enclosing the Barbican fort and the square mile of the City of London, but then had later accretions of the medieval period right up until the very end of the last war, when, of course, the area having been blitzed, we're left with this relic of history, this slice through almost 2,000 years of city history. To be chief planner of a city, which I regard as almost unplannable, but there have been people and organisations over the years that have tried to plan the City of London and indeed London as a whole. Back in the 1960s, in the post-war period, traffic engineers tried to replan the City of London. They wished to create fast roads through the city so the cars could move freely, and they wanted to get the pedestrians out of the way of the vehicles by building upper level walkways and bridges. In fact, the whole of the Barbican estate is developed on this upper level, this deck, with car parking underneath. Now, of course, this is a very abstract way of trying to plan a city with dual carriageway roads and buildings aligned to a Roman grid plan. The City of London, of course, is a much more informal thing, and that is a great strength, because a city with a medieval street plan like the City of London, especially one that's had major disasters like the Great Fire and the Blitz, have plenty of opportunity to adapt and change with the inevitable transformation of people's lives and technologies over the generations. In the late 20th century, the City of London, with its great success as a financial centre, was running out of office floor space. And so at that time, steps were taken to plan new buildings, even built across roads like the one behind me, bridging the road and providing more floor space where there were no development sites available. This was a city that was rising to no more than about 20 stories. It certainly wasn't a skyscraper city, which was the solution being pursued in other parts of the world. And of course it met people's needs. It brought a city back down to ground level with relatively low buildings and allowed us to create more small pocket parks in between them to enhance the lives of the office workers. I'm standing by a monument to the 2 guys who put together the first collected folio of Shakespeare's works. Now, you have to remember that in the late 16th century, Shakespeare's plays were being put on very close to where I'm standing, just outside the city, up in Curtin Road in Shoreditch, and you'll be hearing more about that on your course from Matthew. In 1623, John Hemming and Henry Condell put together the first folio edition. And in fact, just behind the camera in the Guildhall Library, there is a copy of the Shakespeare First Folio in the Guildhall Library. Now, This is an indication that the city has always had a love-hate relationship with leisure and the arts. Although it built the Barbican Art Centre after the last war to make a contribution to the arts, it's always been a little bit iffy about dividing its role between business and other uses. When I first arrived in the city as chief planner back in 1985, all the pubs in the city used to close at 8:30 in the evening. Everybody used to go home to the suburbs because the suburbs were more fun. And I always thought that was wrong because people need to party after work. Well, now, over 3 decades later, there are bars open in the city until 4 in the morning, and Thursday night is party night in the city. And even during COVID, when we're all locked down and over 90% of the workers in the city are working from home, people are still coming in to party and to network. One recent Thursday evening, I went out for a walk around the deserted streets of the city and was surprised to hear laughter and noise coming from some nearby streets. When I arrived, I found that the pubs were as busy as ever, and the young people who normally work in the office had come back in to meet their mates and to party and to see what jobs were going, because business districts, like any thriving community, depend on being where people exchange gossip. Gossip is the glue in society. Gossip, of course, needs to be lubricated if it's to be effective. In some countries, gossip focuses around coffee shops and sitting cafe style at tables. In London and in the UK, more traditionally, gossip happens inside, or preferably outside, of pubs, like this surviving medieval pub in the City of London. And here we are in one of the narrow alleyways that provide pedestrian freeways through the City of London. Learning your way around the City of London is a bit like doing your knowledge as a taxi driver. You have to learn all the shortcuts and back doubles, and only when you've done that can you call yourself a true Londoner. I'm in front of the Royal Exchange, right in the heart of the City of London, at what is generally known as the Bank Junction, because equally behind me we have the Bank of England, the centre of British finance and financial regulation. The Bank Junction is the point where roads met in the centre of the city, some of them going back to Roman times, many introduced in the medieval period, and some in the 19th century by engineers keen to improve movement through the City of London. Well, now of course things are going into reverse in the sense of movement changing from vehicular movement to movement on foot or on bicycle. And one of the advantages, and indeed there are many advantages of the COVID pandemic, is that it has hyper-accelerated changes that were already taking place, both in work patterns and in movement. Work patterns, of course, more and more people were already starting to work from home, and that has increased dramatically during the lockdown. On the transport front, the Bank Junction, which used to be clogged with traffic, and there are even shots in the 19th century showing horse-drawn traffic blocking this junction, and proposals to build elevated pedestrian bridges over the top. We've moved from that period where it is blissfully quiet. Only the buses allowed through and a few delivery vehicles. Streets already being repurposed to create cycle routes and remove the through cars that used to be here. So the city is becoming much more pedestrian and cycle friendly. Although of course there is a question to be asked there as to whether cycle friendly doesn't actually mean pedestrian unfriendly. Behind me we have a cluster of towers dating from the early part of the 21st century. Having built campus-style developments up to 20 stories tall at the end of the 20th century, the city again ran out of office space. And the only way to deal with this was to build a cluster of high-rise buildings in the eastern part of the city, the insurance quarter, as far as possible from St Paul's Cathedral, and clustered tightly together to minimise the environmental damage which tall buildings inevitably do on the skyline of a city. I'm standing in front of the headquarters of Bloomberg in Europe. And of course, Bloomberg is the guy who knows most about business gossip. After all, he's made his fortune out of collecting and transmitting business gossip from around the world to people that can use it for their purposes. And it's not surprising, therefore, that he would choose to build his European headquarters slap bang in the middle of London's historic financial quarter. Now, from the planning point of view, two of the things that interested me about this building obviously were its appearance in a sensitive location next to the Bank Junction and the important heritage buildings in that part of the city, but also pedestrian movement. This is a very large site, previously occupied by a 1960s comprehensive development, and taking it away gave us an opportunity to extend one of London's Roman streets, one of its oldest narrow streets that were much loved by pedestrians, through the development site, linking directly to Cannon Street Station, one of the main commuter stations bringing people from the southeast of England to work in the City of London. And with a little bit of arm twisting with the developer and the architect Norman Foster, we were able to achieve this excellent pedestrian route through the middle of the development, lined with bars and cafes, bridges above linking the two halves of the building to allow them to function together, and at the end of the process all were happy. That was the materials used. The stone out of which the building is made, this sandstone, is derived from a quarry that had been closed for many years, that was specially reopened to produce the material for the building in order to relate the building to a Victorian building next door. However, in conjunction with the stone, we have metal fins, which give you the 21st century image and the aeronautical images so beloved of Lord Foster. The original intention from the client was that these fins should be gold. And I'm afraid I did say, I'm afraid that's bad taste. This isn't Dubai, and we don't want gold in the City of London. We want something that looks better quality than gold. And we ended up with bronze, which I feel is a lot more subtle and less likely to have the building shouting its wares across the street. Here we have a major construction site in the city for a new building to house the dealing activities of Germany's largest bank, Deutsche Bank. It's a complex site because it's built over an underground station at Moorgate, and the whole thing has to be supported on a very substantial steel frame. But land, of course, is so scarce in the City of London that people will go to enormous lengths to create more office floor space. And I think it's interesting at these times when people are wondering about the future of offices, about cities in general, and certainly about world financial centres, about their future, that here we have the activity still pressing ahead, and Deutsche Bank planning to retain their dealing activity in London, even though their headquarters in Frankfurt will be in Europe and London won't be. This indicates the strength of London as an international financial dealing centre and the skills base that we have here. Because after all, places are not made by architects or planners, places are made by people. And in this case, the city is made by the skilled people, the financial dealers and the others engaged in advising business who are based in this 1 square mile. Now, you've seen a lot from me today about a relatively low-rise city with a few taller buildings and even fewer skyscrapers. And you might imagine that I, living in the city, would live in one of the low-rise buildings. Well, I don't. To surprise you, I live on the 27th floor of the block that is behind me. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person, and I'm especially looking forward to your questions. So please, sharpen up those tough questions ready for the live session.